would punk rock be without the iconic leather jacket? In the 1970s, New York bands like Suicide, the Ramones, the Dictators, Blondie, and others cultivated an image incorporating this iconic fashion staple. But the leather jacket we might associate with an aggressive ethos of punk actually had homosexual and queer roots, as does the word punk itself. After World War II, the military-style leather shell jacket found direct application for motorcycle riders. Over time, the black leather jacket came to signify belonging within a growing subculture of motorcycle riders in post-war America. Some motorcycle clubs that organized after World War II understood themselves as social outcasts. Some joined as emotionally wounded veterans. Others felt rejected by a homophobic society. Entirely different reasons compelled others. Whatever their displacement, these socially queer loners took to the open road. American biker gangs in the 1940s and 1950s were homosocial, and in some cases, homosexual fallout from a world at war. A club called the Satyrs, for example, formed in Southern California in 1954, was organized by two members of the founding circle of the Mattachine Society after the gay rights group splintered in 1953. Through groups like the Satyrs and others, the leather motorcycle jacket became a subcultural symbol of homosexual identity and ultimately gay liberation. So how did the black leather jacket become associated with rock and roll and punk rock in 1970s New York? Punk culture's appropriation of the black leather jacket filtered through various vectors of popular culture. Bands like the Ramones and the Dictators were inspired by 1950s icons of American rockabilly, like Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran, who wore black leather jackets. They were inspired by pop culture references like Marlon Brando's biker bad boy role in the film The Wild One, 1953, or the lovable Arthur Fonzarelli from the television sitcom Happy Days, which aired from 1974 to 1984. We decided that punks were people from the 50s like Eddie Cochran and Elvis Presley. Dee Dee Ramone recalled at the incubus of the band's fashion consciousness, you would always see them walking around in motorcycle jackets to really prove you were in the groove. Whether he knew it or not, when Dee Dee Ramone donned a black leather jacket, he wore a symbol of playful, rebellious youth masculinity. Yet it was also a symbol of assertive homosexual identity and ultimately queer liberation. The black leather jacket in punk culture has a provenance as curious and as queer as the word punk itself. I'm Ryan Purcell, and this is Soundscapes. Okay. Soundscapes is a bi-monthly podcast about how music created in New York has shaped the history of the city and how the city itself has been the incubator in which music has blossomed throughout its history. In the last episode, I talked with Jesse Rifkin, a local historian and founder of Walk on the Wild Side Tours N.Y.C. Rifkin took us on a tour of the seedy clubs, bars, and venues that formed a constellation of punk culture in 1970s New York. In this episode, I talked with British music critic Jon Savage about the history of the word punk and the sexual and gendered meanings it has carried through its use in the English language. If you are at all interested in the history of punk rock, you probably have read his masterful account of English punk rock, England's Dreaming, Sex Pistols and Punk Rock by Faber and Faber, 1991. I would also recommend Teenage, The Creation of Youth Culture by Viking Books, 2007, and This Searing Light, The Sun and Everything Else, Joy Division, again by Faber and Faber, 2019. Savage has also done documentaries like The Brian Epstein Story, 1988, and Joy Division, 2007, as well as the feature film Teenage, 2013, both based on his books. I'm very excited about the anticipated release of his next book, The Secret Public, How LGBTQ Resistance Shaped Popular Culture from 1955 to 1979, which will be published by Faber and Faber in February 2025. This is an electrifying look at key moments in music and entertainment history which have helped move gay culture from the margins to mainstream, and in doing so, has changed the face of pop forever. From the ambiguous sexuality of stars like Little Richard in the 1950s, through the glam rock of David Bowie, ending at the dawn of the Thatcher and Reagan regimes with Sylvester's You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. The Secret Public is a searching examination of the fortitude and resilience of the gay community through the lens of popular music and culture. I've long been a fan of Savage's writing, and I'm so excited to talk with him now on Soundscapes about the hidden histories of punk rock in 1970s New York. Jon Savage, thank you so much for joining us today. I brought you on the show today to talk about your recent book, The Secret Public, How the LGBTQ plus aesthetic shaped popular culture from 1955 to 1979. So it's a massive book, 700 pages, heavily researched, more than 50 pages of notes and references where you talk about key moments in music history where queer culture permeates popular culture. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that aesthetic, that LGBTQ plus aesthetic? How do you define that aesthetic?
Especially in the early days, if we start with Little Richard, then it's a certain wildness and it's a certain, don't give an F quality. And that's very exciting, I'm going to have some fun tonight. Well, anybody can relate to that. And also the sense of something different. And in the first part, there are 5 parts. The first part of 1955. I also talk about James Dean. Now, there's lots of stories about whether James Dean was gay or not. In a way, that's not so interesting as what he represented, which was something very androgynous and ambiguous in terms of what it was to be a man. And my point about the early days, and certainly that spills over into Elvis the next year, who was not gay, but had a femininity about him that in the early days, as I say in the book, he was treated by conservative commentators as a female prostitute or a burlesque artist. He was so shocking. And what teens wanted in this new youth culture was not the machismo of John Wayne or somebody like that. That was old hat. They wanted something more subtle, more feminized, and that's something that queer culture could and did definitely inform.
What I like so much about the framework of your book is that you situate these popular artists, like you said, Little Richard, James Dean, David Bowie, Sylvester. You reframe these popular artists as transgressive artists. In some ways, you depict them as transcending barriers, whether that be legislative barriers or social barriers. They're really pushing the needle for societies in which they are performing and putting out art. And I'm thinking about just the mere legislation of homosexuality, where that singers in the UK and the United States were not able to fully be themselves, but on stage or on record, they're able to exude their private identities in a public forum. And I think that's so fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about some more examples like Little Richard, about how he's maneuvering that landscape?
Well, famously, the original lyrics of Tutti Frutti were about anal sex, to be blunt. Little Richard was thoroughly steeped in the black music traditions. He'd worked in medicine shows, he'd worked in drag shows, he'd worked in R&B for years. So he really encompassed a lot of the previously hidden or previously not very well known Black American music tradition. So, he wasn't just somebody who came out of nowhere. He'd done this apprenticeship and he found an opening and a space, and it was instinctive, much like the very early Elvis records. People didn't know what they were doing, but they knew what they'd found when they heard it. So he used that space to be absolutely outrageous. And in a way, the book begins and ends with 2 not entirely dissimilar characters, with Sylvester, who's another Black American who's been through the mill. He's done all sorts of things. He's worked in radical drag. He's made rock records where he covers Neil Young tunes. And then suddenly he finds his métier, which is electronic disco, and becomes a worldwide star, maybe even a superstar. And these are incredibly important moments because they're validation, they're affirmation. And particularly in Sylvester's case, he could be open about who he was in a way that Richard, 24 years before, 23 years before, couldn't because of the times. And what I do in the book is also in each chapter, in each of the 5 parts, give an indication of how the legal and social situation was for gay people in England and America. And it was pretty dire, certainly in the 50s and the 60s and the early 60s. And it only really changed with Stonewall and gay liberation in the late 60s and early 70s.
Sylvester is a great example of this kind of transgressive quality that you find in these popular performers. And I'm thinking about the context of like this show, my show Soundscapes, and like you mentioned Sylvester's involvement with drag theater. I'm thinking about the Cockettes from San Francisco.
Exactly.
History occurs to me, like the Cockettes come to New York City in the early 1970s. And I'm aware of some instances where the Cockettes are performing, for example, at Hilly's on the Bowery. That becomes CBGB's. And I think that's such an interesting kind of porousness where these spaces in New York City in the 1970s, they're hosting a variety of different musical acts that have with them meanings and worldviews and politics behind the styles.
Well, particularly the Whiz Kids, who were Tomato Du Plenty, the Screamers, was involved with them. They played CBGB's. And CBGB's I don't really go into very much because it wasn't particularly gay. And in fact, because a lot of the punk scene in England and America was in reaction to glam rock, glitter rock, which had been overtly gay, it was almost anti-gay. There was a famous incident where Dick Manitoba, slagged off Wayne County on stage, and Jane, sorry, I don't want to misgender her, Jane County hit her with a mic, with a microphone stand. So there was a lot of aggro about this topic in Britain and America, even though a lot of the people, as you say, in the early days of CBGBs and in the early days of London punk were gay. But because it became rock music didn't allow, until Tom Robinson came along, much overt homosexuality. It was because it was aimed at heterosexual young white males. Whereas the dance scene was much more porous and much more easily influenceable in terms of gay DJs, gay clubs, the gay audience, as of course I write about in the book. It's a wonderful story.
So this begs the question. So you have all these artists that are transgressive, both stylistically and even socially, but I'm wondering if there is a way in which, like, how does this popular culture, how does this popular music interact with the ongoing social movements? Does it add fodder to the social movements? How is it interacting with the social movements? Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. I like to think in terms of soft power and hard power. This is not a sexual thing. Soft power is cultural power, and this is mainly what I'm talking about in the book. But if it's allied to and harnessed to hard power, which is political agitation, making a nuisance of yourself, doing what very brave activists did really from the 1950s onwards in England and America. And, the combined effect of both is actually very powerful. And there's no doubt that the pop culture of the 60s in England and America gave extra impetus to ideas of gay liberation, in particular, I'm afraid to say, particularly the hippie movement and drugs, that loosened a lot of things up. And there was definitely a generational sense of we're not going to take this anymore. That was right across the board. It wasn't just amongst LGBTQ people. Although, of course, with Stonewall and with gay liberation in the UK, that's what happened. And in the UK, Bowie was incredibly important, probably less so in the States, sadly. I know he had hits, but in his first stage, he announced to the Melody Maker, which is a major British music paper, in January 1972 that he was gay and always had been. And this was an absolute sensation. He was the first star to really do that. Dusty Springfield had sort of come out a couple of years before, but he was the first star to really do that in an unapologetic and gleeful and fun way. And he had this enormous impact on British pop culture. Everybody for a couple of years with glam rock, which was very, very successful in the UK. It wasn't just Bowie, it was Sweet, who had, a succession of, top records, and Roxy Music and Suzi Quatro. Glam rock was huge in the UK. T-Rex, it was the biggest youth style in 72, 73. And Bowie was at the center of it. And in doing that, I know he's been criticized for kind of reheterosexualizing himself, but he's a pop star. He's not a politician. And what he did then was incredibly brave and very generous, because what he was actually doing was, and I trace this in the book, I trace Bowie's involvement with the gay world and with gay liberation, really from the mid-60s until he came out in 72 or 73. And what he was doing was just being truthful to the people he hung out with and truthful about his own sexuality, which was bisexual with a preference towards women. And he just said, it'd be really embarrassing if I came out and pretended to be this massive star, because I'm just not. So there's an element of truth in there. And to have somebody telling the truth for the first time, really, in an open way, was incredibly liberating for a generation of kids in the UK. Probably less in the US, but he was quite successful in the US, but he didn't really hit till a bit later when he had the soul hits with Fame.
Early in the series, I talked with Tony Sinetta, the president of Main Man Artistes, David Bowie's rights management company, about the influence of David Bowie on the New York rock scene during the early 1970s. And I was wondering, because you talk about David Bowie in your book, where does queer culture reside in the influence of David Bowie's work on the New York rock scene? Like, is punk, in other words, reaction to that that truthfulness that you talked about with Bowie, or is there some hidden LGBTQ aesthetic within the punk movement in the early 70s?
Well, I've got 3 words to say: 53rd and 3rd. It seems fairly clear that Dee Dee had, and you may have to check this, but I'm pretty sure he worked as a hustler. And Danny Fields was involved with the Ramones, and he was a gay maven from way back, and Andy Warhol on the Velvets. So even though the style might have been, we're not glam, glam's over, we're going to be a little bit tougher, we're going to be a little bit more stripped down, gay people were involved. Jane County, very important. So it was there. People didn't play it up. I mean, Patti Smith used to open up Redondo Beach with, this is a song about women who love other women. So, it was there, but it wasn't up front like it had been in the glam days, simply because that wasn't the style. And that was the same in the UK. And it made it all the more shocking, really, when Johnny Rotten called, well, I think he was referring to David Johansen, bored little faggot. I always hated that line in New York. It seemed completely unnecessary, because a lot of the people involved in the early British punk scene were gay. A lot of the fans, a lot of the close-knit fans in the early days, and some of the musicians. And it was a lot harder, really, for people then to come out. I mean, Pete Shelley Buzzcocks pronounced himself bisexual, and he was a friend of mine, and I know that was the case. And obviously Tom Robinson, Gene October of Chelsea. But it wasn't so much of a big thing, again, because of that reaction against, the perceived decadence of glam and glitter rock, which had come just before. So, each new pop movement has to say, we're different from anything else ever. But of course, that's not true.
Now, there's certainly a continuum, as you demonstrate in your book, which leads me into my next question. You have an essay called Punk Etymology, the history of the word punk, in a collection called Punk is Dead, Modernity Killed Every Night, 2017. And in that essay, I thought it was so illuminating. Like, you trace the history of the word punk back to the 17th century, perhaps even before that. Can you talk a little bit about what you were saying in that essay about the history of the word punk and the meanings that it has carried over time?
Well, I mean, it's a work in progress, and I wish people would add to it, because it's only partial. I mean, there's so many, I keep on finding instances, and I forget to put them into it. But basically, the general idea of punk, whether it be a piece of wood or whether it be a prostitute, is that this is something or somebody who's worthless. And this, obviously, in general terms, ties in with a lot of the way that gay people used to think about themselves, maybe still do. If you've got society telling you that you are a POS from day one, then it's not going to make you feel good about yourself. And I regard gay mental health as being, LGBTQ mental health as being a really important topic, because, a lot of, I certainly felt worthless when I was coming out into the world in my early 20s, which was a horrible feeling and entirely unnecessary and very cruel. So there's that general sense of being worthless, and obviously then what you get is it's a prison term. It's a prison term. I don't know how explicit you want me to be, but I get very amused because a lot of American commentators get very macho about punk, and I just say, well, one derivation of the word is about the younger man in prison who takes it up the arse from the older man. There you go. So how can you be macho when that's one of the meanings of punk, one of the core meanings? And so you get this sense of worthlessness and criminality in 40s film noir when people are called punk. You get it in the 50s, people are called, punk. And then you get this sort of very interesting use of the word from the early 70s onwards by American rock critics, people like Lenny Kaye, Dave Marsh, and Greg Shaw, who were involved in this sort of fanzine activist culture, trying to get a 70s rock music started, because the 60s were so oppressive at the start of the 70s. And they were saying, well, it's the 70s now. What's going to be the 70s rock? It's got to be more direct. It's got to be teenage. No more James Taylor. And there was, Lester Bangs' famous essay, James Taylor marked for death. Well, actually, I quite liked James Taylor, but I knew I got what they were talking about. I went to see James Taylor in 1971 in a very tough working class town in the north of England called Newcastle. It was very, very nice. And then I came out and I was walking with my friend back to the train station, and we saw this gang of skinheads throw somebody through a plate glass window. And I said to my friend, the music that we've just heard doesn't really tally with what we're seeing here. And that was the problem with James Taylor. And that's why teens like me, I was 18 in 71, I wanted hard rock. And it was very, very hard to find. And so that's what they were talking about. And so anybody really, from Led Zeppelin to, in 72, 3, 4, in rock crit circles, there was a wide use of punk. Anybody from Alice Cooper, even to Led Zeppelin to Kiss. But also there was the wonderful compilation by Lenny Kaye called Nuggets, which really started to codify the use of the word in terms of 60s. We'd now call it garage, 60s punk, which is a huge, huge favorite of mine. I think it's fantastic. I love that compilation. And again, it's like this idea of a teen music that's raw and aggressive and quite simple, but contains all sorts of messages about the world and teen problems, which if you're a teenager is absolutely great. Couldn't be better. And then slowly morphs really into its codification again by John Holmstrom in late 75, where he calls his New York magazine about CBGBs, he calls it punk. That's the big step. And then from 75 onwards, you get all sorts being called punk. And after a lot of disagreement, it's also applied to London punk in the latter half of 76. And that's really where that goes.
So whether it's called punk, whether it's called garage rock, it's really just hard rock. Is that what you're talking about?
Hard rock that's concise. I mean, I wouldn't say Led Zeppelin were punk because of those solos. I mean, it's got to last about 2.5 minutes, Say what you're going to say, make it very clear, make it noisy, and then leave.
So in this essay, you say punk was a brutally simple short word ending with a percussive K, like rock. It preempted the reaction to this new generation of brutally apparent, incompetent rock music. And I think it's really interesting. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the history of this word as you describe in your essay, because I think that it's more than just the notion of disposability. I think that there's more meanings to this history word, which can help us understand the so-called punk rock movement as it becomes ascribed to the music. Like, for example, in the 18th century in your essay, you say that punk was a term used to identify a younger man kept by an older man for sexual pleasure. We already talked about this. A punk was at bottom whether he liked it or not. But also in the American Revolution as well. I mean, it's sometimes referred to, punk is, as you mentioned, a piece of wood, like a piece of foliage, right? That's used sometimes to burn things. And I found references to this during the American Revolution where British soldiers are describing these revolutionaries as punks, as they burn bright and they burn intensely like punks. They fight like punks. And perhaps there's also an indigenous meaning behind that word as well. And then the 1890s, this notion of disposability, but you even bring it back to Shakespeare. Shakespeare uses the term to denote a sex worker or a prostitute in this case, and with subtle hints of transvestism, some gender ambiguity with this character. Could you talk a little bit more about more of the depth of this word?
Well, if you're talking about pieces of wood used for fire, then punk was very inflammatory. It was very hot. It was very fiery and it burned itself out very quickly, certainly in London, which is what I witnessed. So there is that. There was subtle gender ambiguity there in that the kind of groups I was interested in. The interesting thing about the Sex Pistols is that they weren't actually macho, or their frontman wasn't macho. And Johnny Rotten was a very, very curious frontman, and that he expressed all sorts of things, quite confusing, quite threatening, quite vulnerable. A lot of the early punks were quite vulnerable. I saw the Clash in 1976, and they seemed like hurt, scared boys before they started wearing military uniforms and got all macho, which meant that they were boring. I couldn't stand all that stuff. It's really tedious. Boy gangs. And I liked groups in London. I liked the groups that had the female musicians in because they were doing something that nobody had ever done before, like the Slits and X-Ray Specs and Gay Advert and Penetration. I thought that was terrific. And Susie and the Banshees, who were a great favourite of mine, because they were very perverse. And I liked a bit of perversity, something that was different, something that was hinting at taboos. Taboo was incredibly important in that respect, and uncovering taboos, which is kind of dangerous thing to do in pop culture, but it was still absolutely fascinating. And also you had kind of hopeless boys who weren't macho, like Buzzcocks, who were great, again, a great favourite of mine, saw them a lot then. and Subway Sect, who are another great favorite of mine. And so there's this alternative history of punk, really, which is not, the Stranglers and the Clash and the Jam, all of whom were quite macho in their own way, but actually dealt quite subtly with different gender roles. Yes, it's much more complicated. People have a very simplistic view about punk, but that's okay. It's going to be 50 years in a couple of years. So there you go, 50 years ago.
Let's take a step back and explore the soundscape that Jon Savage is illustrating. In the 1950s, Little Richard expressed his identity as a gay black man in songs like Tutti Frutti, released by Specialty Records in 1955. Although the original lyrics referencing gay sex were censored, the euphemisms for gay love and the spirit with which Richard sings lives on in this track. Queer culture that Little Richard expressed in veiled terms on Tutti Frutti found full expression in punk rock. Here's a track called Man Enough to Be a Woman by Wayne County and Electric Chairs, released by Safari Records in 1978.
It's hard to be true to the one that's really you. I've got a scandalous feeling. It's hard to be true when they point and stare at you. Conditioned to portraying the mask of masculinity. Another blend of different shading. I am what I am. I don't give a damn. I wanna know. 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 Are you man enough to be a woman?
And of course, you can hear that same quality on many disco tracks from the 1970s. Here's a track called You Make Me Feel Mighty Real by Sylvester, released by Fantasy Records in 1978. Now, let's get back to our conversation. Your book, England's Dreaming, is a classic. You demonstrate the rise of punk rock in the UK and the United States during the mid to late 1970s. I also love the England's Dreaming tapes by University of Minnesota Press. Super helpful for my own research. Before we get into that book, in January 2025, I'm going to be releasing an episode where I talk with punk scholar Matt Warley.
Oh, yeah, of course. I know, Matt. Yeah.
In that conversation, we talk about Jubilee, the Derek Jarman film from 1978.
Oh, great film. Great film. I have the globe. I have the globe in my house.
You have that, like one of the props from the film?
Yeah, I have one of the props.
How did you get that?
I got a couple of Derek Jarman pictures in here as well. He was a friend of mine.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So you were able to get these props and like as mementos and relics. But
I said, Derek, you don't want those. Give them to me. You have no need of them anymore.
Really?
Go on, gears.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's tons of stuff that came from that. I brought this film up because we were talking about punk in the UK. And in some ways, that film was punk and disseminated the aesthetics of punk rock. But in some ways, like it was very controversial in terms of like Vivienne Westwood didn't seem to like the film and had some issues with, for example, Jordan's portrayal in that film.
Yeah, but Vivienne could be very capricious. She could be very capricious. And also she thought she owned it, I mean, that was bad behavior. It was very homophobic, that T-shirt.
Oh, the open letter to Derek.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but no. Yeah, I mean, that was a bad moment.
Are you talking about the T-shirt she put out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, she seemed to not like that. But I'm thinking like, well, was she just trying to create controversy to create sensationalism around it? I'm not sure. I don't know.
She's dead. So's Derek.
Right. So that's the past, I suppose.
Yeah.
Getting back to punk rock, I'm thinking about this Ramones uniformed look. The leather jackets, the ripped jeans. And you mentioned how 53rd and 3rd, I think that was a great kind of point to focus on to illustrate like that secret public, that idea of the secret public you're talking about within punk rock, perhaps, and this hustler culture. Where else can we find that secret public LGBTQ plus aesthetic in punk rock?
Well, I was going to say Buzzcocks, sure. Orgasm Addict is a classic example, which is one of their greatest singles and had a wonderful sleeve by Linda Sterling, who's a feminist artist. Linda Sterling and I did a magazine in late 77 called The Secret Public. Hang on, I think I have one here. Let me just bring it down. And it was all montage. Hang on. It's not coming. Never mind. Google it. It's called The Secret Public, and it's by Jon Savage and Linda Sterling. And a lot of the images in it were all to do with gender and sexuality. And that was printed and funded to a great degree by Buzzcocks management, Richard Boone, and it was the second release on New Hormones after the Buzzcocks Sparrow Scratch. So they were probably the standard bearers of it, also because they were really good. And this is something we haven't talked about. It's okay having out LGBTQ performers, but if they're not very good, it doesn't make any impact and is rather embarrassing. So, hello, Gibriath. And we're only talking about Buzzcocks really because they were so good. And they still remain one of the best punk rock groups I listen to them still in a way that I don't listen to Clash, because the Clash just sound as though they're trying too hard.
Yeah, almost like reiterating a political manifesto in some ways. It's very on the nose. Whereas Buzzcocks, like the rhythm of the Buzzcocks, Orgasmatic, for example, like there's something very distinct about that sound and that energy behind the sound that drives home a message very quite subtly, in a more subtle way than perhaps the Clash. I don't know.
Well, Jubilee is also a site for LGBTQ punk because it's got Jean October of Chelsea in it. It's got Jane County in it. It's got, the leading girl group Slits in it briefly. It's got a gay couple as leading characters. And of course, it was done by a gay director. And it was an allegory. And it wasn't straight social realism. British punk had become much more to do with social realism in 1978. The kids on the streets, which of course was absolute crap. Because early punk was nothing like that. It wasn't about the kids on the streets. It was about outsiders and people who were different and wanted something new. And the other thing about Jubilee is that it's a really good record of how London was in 1977 when it was shot. It's got great, great street scenes, and it reminds you of what the city was like, which was there were large areas of dereliction in it. So, it's a great film and definitely well worth watching if you can find it.
Oh, without a doubt. It is a classic. I found it through Criterion Classics, the Criterion collection. I love it. And I'm thinking about, we had this conversation with Matt Worley about Jubilee, and he said pretty much what you just said, that it's a good documentation of London during the 70s, late 70s. And he was talking about how that's so different than the reality of London today, where in ruin, there is possibility. Yeah. For something new, a new society, perhaps, or at least a change in that society. In London today, and perhaps the same thing for New York City, there is the sense of less of a possibility of change. It's gentrified. It's difficult to live there, just monetarily speaking, financially speaking. But in the 70s, both New York and London seemed to be this place of possibility. That's what I'm thinking about in terms of punk. Bringing this queer LGBTQ plus aesthetics in some ways to a landscape and building up and reimagining the city, whether that be London and New York City, in new ways, new, more expansive social realities. Whether those realities come to fruition or not, that seems to be part of the punk ethos, at least in the beginning, or what it might not even be called punk at that time. It's hard. It's like a retrospectively applied term to the musical styles. I don't know.
Well, yes. Punk was very urban. And again, that was a reaction against the hippies. we're not going to go all go back to the garden. Thank you very much. We're going to stay in the inner city and make it work. There were lots of groups, the CBGB's groups, the London punk groups, Clash in particular in the early days. I identified the Clash very much with a district near where I lived in London then, which is West 10 and West 11. And I did a fanzine very early on, which was inspired by the Clash, which had lots of pictures of high rises and blank walls and dereliction. And it was a period where young people could live cheaply near the center of the city. And also, it wasn't about money in the early days. Everything is about money now. But then, and consumerism, but then it was about, it was about literally making art out of nothing and not expecting to get paid for it, but, doing it because that's what you had to do. So a lot of it, certainly in the early days and throughout, it wasn't tainted by music industry money. It was very pure expression, and it was very pure youth expression. And that's what makes punk still interesting to people now, because it's just this concentrated moment of very pure youth expression.
Can you tell me a little bit about the story of the creation of England's Dreaming? It's such a phenomenal classic work, and it still holds a lot of power today in terms of conceptualizing the history of this period and the sonic history of this period.
Oh, okay.
How did this come to be? What is the backstory behind this collection? Perhaps through music journalism or some other route?
Yes, I was a music journalist for Sounds magazine from early 1977. So I covered punk, really London punk, as it was happening. And of course, a lot of the American groups, the CBGB's groups, came to the UK. So I saw everyone. And in the mid to late 80s, when I was first thinking about this, nobody wanted to know about punk. And that, of course, made it interesting because people hadn't got their rap down. There wasn't this official history. I mean, I have to say, it's lovely that everybody says these kind things about England's Dreaming, but it wasn't meant to be the definitive history. It was just really, like all my books, it's meant to open up the topic. And then if anybody else wants to come along and add to it and do something else with the topic, then that's great, because, it's a very, very complex and interesting topic, and a time when a lot of things happened in a very short space, and nobody wants to know about punk. And I was able to talk to about 100 people and get fairly unguarded responses. The official history hadn't kicked in yet. So it's rather like I did a documentary about Brian Epstein and the Beatles manager. And the problem we always had was that people would trot out the official stories. And we had to get beneath that, where I didn't have to do that when I was doing the book, because the official stories didn't yet exist. And I was able to talk to all of the Sex Pistols except Sid, who was long gone. And so that's what it was. And I wanted to put it in the context of time and place. What was London like then? How was it different to things were, when I was writing the book 10 years later? So it's really that. I hadn't seen anybody else write a history of punk or an account of those years that matched what I saw and what I felt. So it was simply, oh, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'll do it.
Well, you did do it, and people are following in your footsteps, including me. I'm writing a book, kind of like I do see you opening up this conversation about many different things, and it is quite complex. I'm writing this book about punk in the 1970s, like focusing on Jane County and the world that Jane County created and the meanings behind that music. So I'm very grateful that you did open that conversation for scholars like myself to kind of follow those breadcrumbs that you laid. Really appreciate that.
Well, I do love Jane. I think she's fantastic. I mean, I have spent some time with her. She and I DJ'd together one night, and I have to say she really knows her 60s punk rock.
Hold on. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, what context is your DJ in Jane County? What, in the UK?
Yeah, I was at a Patty Paladin gig. Patty was a good friend of Jane, and I used to meet her through Patty. I haven't seen either of them for years, but I was friendly with Lee Black Childers as well, who was part of that gang. And Lee was a part of early British punk. I really liked Lee. It was great when all the Americans came over, because all these gay managers came over, Max McCarry, Peter Crowley, and Lee. And they were all fabulous characters, very exotic creatures for us Londoners. And Lee brought over the Heartbreakers, Max McCarry brought over Cherry Vanilla, and Peter Crowley brought over Jane. And I saw Jane play at the Roxy. And Jane always went beyond. She always went beyond.
Well, that's about 76, would you say, with Crowley and Childers and Jane County and
Very early 77.
77. Okay. And I'm
very early 77. Yeah.
And I'm always thinking about that altercation you mentioned between Dick Manitoba and Jane County. And, in County's memoir, Man Enough to Be a Woman, which is phenomenal. I love it. And in that memoir, she's talking about the reasons why she goes to the UK first in 77, I think you said, and talking about the professional opportunities that are drying up in New York City, especially with the dissolution of Main Man. But I'm also thinking about, to what extent does homophobia or transphobia have to do with that? I mean, I'm thinking about this violent altercation between Dick Manitoba and Jane County, which you don't really hear about until much. And homophobic and transphobic, rhetoric is being slung back and forth. Do you think that's a possibility that she kind of felt alienated in a scene that was becoming increasingly xenophobic?
I don't know, but it certainly is a possibility. And there was that strain in punk. I mean, if you're going to have people acting like suburban kids who go to White Castle, you've got the danger of having homophobic attitudes. There was always a fine line in that, in punk, I thought. Even though, I met John Holmstrom since, and he's a lovely guy. But I think, again, it's that wish to create a difference between this generation and the previous generation of glitter rockers. And it's very interesting. I went out to the West Coast and saw the West Coast punk scene in late summer 1978. And I talk about this in my book. And I met the Screamers, hung out with the Screamers for quite a long time. I really liked them. And we were absolutely horrible to each other, but that's the way people were then. And that was okay. That's just that's just the way things were. And I was gay, two of them were gay, but did we talk about it? Did we fuck? And I now regard that as a real lost opportunity. And of course, Darby Crash of the Germs was also gay and didn't dare talk about it. And in retrospect, it just seems ridiculous. Why not? The only one that really did was Black Randy, who did that wonderful song Trouble at the Cup about gay hustlers. So it was, it's a very, very different time. And I now regret that we didn't talk about what it was like to be gay and what were the politics of it, but we just didn't. So there was, if not homophobia, then an unwillingness really to breach the topic. And I think that's because, as I said before, it wasn't disco, and the official gay culture was all about disco, which I completely missed and more fool me, because I was into punk rock. But the big change for me was hearing I Feel Love and Magic Fly by Space. And that's when I started to get bored with punk rock. I thought, actually, this is not new anymore. The music industry has taken over. It's become Four Guys in Leather Jackets and, Sub Ramones, thrash. There are a lot of really bad punk groups in London in 77. And people say now, oh, they were great. No, they weren't. They were shit. I saw them, I heard their records and they were really bad. And so suddenly this electronic futuristic disco was the way to go. That was certainly for me.
So there's a tremendous energy behind this music, punk. That's, we'll call it punk rock, call it hard rock. There's a tremendous energy behind this music. Where does it go after the 1970s? As you mentioned, the electronic music and
Nirvana. And I interviewed Kurt in 93, and he was a very, very interesting character. I really liked him. I don't know about drugs and guns. That's not my line. I don't know anything about those topics. So I didn't know that he was so into guns and so into drugs, heroin. But he was very pro-gay. And he and I got on like a house on fire. We got on really well. And it did strike me parenthetically that the only really interesting American groups to me of the 80s, mid to late 80s, R.E.M. and Husker Du, both had gay frontmen who were not out at the time. But that, again, is a sign of difference, and they were doing something very, very different. And Kurt was doing something very different. And also, the problem for Kurt, he had the punk rock problem, which was that to be a success was a failure, and that to be a failure was to be a success. And that punk kind of perplex has been a real problem for people who identify as punk, who particularly identify with, hardcore punk and particularly who identify with those kind of scenes, that scene aspect of punk. But I thought Nirvana were terrific. I was not interested in hardcore. I thought it was ghastly. Again, macho. The energy of punk in the UK went into all sorts of things. I also did a book about Joy Division. That was a group that was stimulated by punk. And people ran with it and took it into all sorts of different directions, including elements of disco and Blondie Heart of Glass, great record. That shows that you can come out of punk and make a great pop disco record. And so you start to get the crossover from 78 onwards, which is a great relief. And I certainly find, the persistence of punk beyond sort of 79 rather archaic, really. I don't see the point of it, which got me into a lot of trouble because people say, oh, hardcore or this and that. And I was thinking, yeah, did it all in 76, 77. Sorry. I wish I wasn't there.
Well, Jon, I have no further questions for you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. It's been really great. And it feels like this conversation has been opening up organically. And I really get to know more than what I'm asking, really. So I'm very grateful.
Okay, Ryan, I've got my yoga class to go to.
All right, Jon. That sounds great. It's lovely talking to you again. And perhaps we can collaborate again in the future.
Okay, great to meet you, Ryan. Okay.
Great to meet you too. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.
That was my conversation with British music critic Jon Savage. And I hope it was as fun to listen to as it was to record. In the next episode, I talked with John Hallstrom, the founding editor of Punk magazine, which ran from 1976 to 1979 and solidified the connection between downtown New York rock and the word punk. We'll talk about Hallstrom's illustrations, his work at SVA, and the connection between comic book culture and punk rock. I want to give a few shout outs. First to Will Riley for providing the theme song for today's episode. Thank you to my production assistant, Ava Castro Di Verona, for providing technical assistance on this episode. Thank you also to the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate Center in Midtown Manhattan, and for the generous support of the Urban History Association. Updates about Soundscapes are being featured on the Urban History Association's newsletter, and a profile of the Soundscapes podcast will be published on the Metropole, the official blog of the Urban History Association, later this year. Please check socials for updates. At Instagram, that's at Soundscapes N.Y.C. Again, at Instagram, that's at Soundscapes N.Y.C. And finally, I want to thank you for tuning in. This is the conclusion of episode 5 in a 10-episode series on the genderqueer roots of punk rock in 1970s New York. We are halfway through the inaugural season of the Soundscapes N.Y.C. podcast, but that means we have 5 more exciting episodes right around the corner. We'll explore themes like Bruce Springsteen's engagement with punk rock and other strange bedfellows. We'll discuss the complicated politics of defining genres and the cultural legacy of punk rock in New York City history and beyond. I hope you'll come along for the rest of this journey. I'm Ryan Purcell. Until next time.
All this time I will be patient. I'll be singing along to the radio station, hoping one day you'll come around and you'll see, yeah, you're coming back to me, back to me, back to me, back to me.